That summer in Portland had a strange air about it, as if the sun and rain had agreed to take turns without warning. Laura, barely 22 years old, lived alone in a small one-room apartment that smelled of old wood and reheated coffee. She had graduated just a few weeks earlier with a degree in environmental engineering, with top honors and a citation the university reserved only for the very best. She hung her diploma on the peeling wall, knowing no one in her family would ever see it, not even a photo. Her mother was too busy choosing flowers for Jessica's wedding, and her father was busy telling everyone how lucky he was to have a successful and beautiful daughter. The irony was that that daughter wasn't her. Laura was the other one, the one no one remembered to mention, the one who worked 3 different jobs to pay for college, while her family boasted about a perfection that didn't exist. The apartment had become her refuge and her witness. It had a second-hand table she bought for $40 and a lamp that flickered every now and then, as if it too was tired. Still, there she felt free. She spent her nights in front of the computer sending out resumes, dreaming of a job that would allow her to start over, far from the awkward silences and comparisons. The day she received the email from Thornberry Systems, a name that sounded like a promise, she didn't scream or cry. She just stared at the screen, motionless, feeling that the world was finally seeing her. There was no applause, no hugs, no calls from family. But within that silence that was so characteristic of her, something changed. For the first time, she was certain that she no longer needed to be seen to exist. Jessica's wedding announcement arrived in an ivory envelope with gold lettering and a light floral scent that reminded Laura of the stifling Sundays of her childhood, when her mother forced them to pose together for photos that always ended up being just of Jessica. She read the invitation calmly, but the message on the back, written by her mother, struck her more than any elegant words. Your father already paid for your part of the dress and the trip, so don't make excuses this time. She closed the envelope slowly, as if afraid something alive would jump out. There were no excuses, she thought. There were wounds, and there was dignity. And this time neither of them fit the role of the complacent guest. Over the following nights, as the rain pounded persistently against the window, Laura began to plan something she didn't even know if it was a farewell or an act of justice. She took out of a small metal box all the receipts for the loans she had paid during college, the transfers, the bills. She added them all up and subtracted the money her father said he had invested in her education. The result was exact: $12,350. That figure remained etched in her mind like a kind of password to her freedom. She decided then to write a check for that amount, put it in a white envelope, and put it in her purse. She didn't know if she would have the courage to hand it over, but she knew that if she didn't, she would remain the shadow of a story that didn't belong to her. The wedding day dawned under a sky so clear, it seemed like a mockery. Laura dressed leisurely in a navy blue dress she had previously worn to a job interview. It wasn't a festive outfit, but one that represented who she was now, someone who didn't have to impress anyone. As she applied her makeup in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, she noticed her hands shaking, not from fear, but from a kind of anticipated liberation. She took the envelope containing the check, put it in her purse, and went out into the hallway of the building, where an elderly neighbor wished her luck, unaware that his words seemed almost prophetic. On the walk to the church, she mentally reviewed what she would say if her father confronted her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to justify herself. She arrived 15 minutes late, enough to make her mother uncomfortable, who greeted her with the stiff smile of someone who fears social judgment more than the truth. You always had to attract attention, she muttered under her breath, smoothing her dress as if that would erase her discomfort. Her father watched her from afar, arms crossed, and as soon as she approached, he let out a theatrical sigh. You finally decided to show up, and with that face. No one asked how she was, or mentioned her graduation, or even her life. They just wanted her to smile in the photos, like always. But Laura, still holding the envelope, knew this would be the last time she would pretend to be part of something that never included her. When the photographer asked everyone to gather for a family photo, Laura felt a familiar pressure in her chest, that mix of discomfort and resignation that had accompanied her throughout her life. Her father took her arm tightly, forcing a gesture of harmony as he whispered in her ear, "Smile, at least this time don't embarrass us." And it was at that instant, with the camera flash illuminating her tired face, that she decided to do it. Not the fake smile he demanded, but the true gesture that accompanies a farewell. She took the envelope from her purse, held it for a moment, and extended it to him amid the general murmur. Her mother looked at her in confusion. Jessica, from the altar, frowned, and her father, bewildered, broke the silence with a brief nervous laugh before opening the envelope. Inside was the check, neatly folded with her signature in blue ink and a brief note, "To settle any outstanding debts." Her father's face drained of color. He read the value, looked up, and tried to regain control of the situation. "What does this mean?" he asked, his voice thick with suppressed rage. Laura stared at him, with a calmness that surprised even herself, and replied what she had been waiting years to say. "It's the, money you paid for my first semester. I no longer owe you anything." Some guests glanced at each other, others lowered their heads, pretending not to hear. Her mother tried to intervene, but Laura continued firmly, "Thank you for the education, but I prefer freedom." Then she turned on her heel, leaving behind the music, the lights, and a family that finally saw her, just as she decided to leave. The sound of her own footsteps on the marble floor seemed deafening as she walked away. Each echo was a confirmation that there was no turning back. Outside, the fresh air hit her in the face like a slap, waking her from a long sleep. She heard the shouts behind her mother's voice calling her by her full name, her father's demanding that she come back to apologize. But Laura kept walking without looking back, her heart pounding in her ears, and the empty envelope still trembling in her hands. On the corner, a boy offered her a flower he didn't buy, but she accepted it anyway. The sense of peace that filled her amidst the chaos was absurd. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel guilty about disappointing anyone. That night, back in her apartment, the silence was different. It didn't have the weight of loneliness, but the soft texture of something that finally breaks without a sound. She sat on the floor, still wearing her shoes, and let the tears come without resistance. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief. Her phone vibrated nonstop. Calls from her mother. Angry texts from her father. Endless audio messages from Jessica. She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she opened her laptop and wrote her letter of resignation to Fear. It wasn't literal, of course. It was a file with no addressee in which she wrote, "I am no one's disappointment. I am my own beginning." Then she closed the computer, turned off the lights, and allowed herself to sleep, certain that by dawn she would no longer be the invisible daughter. The following days were a strange mix of silence and noise. Silence at home, where the only sound was the old coffee maker bubbling away every morning. Noise on the phone, which never stopped ringing. Her mother sent messages full of dramatic phrases. "You ruined your sister's happiest day. How could you humiliate us like that?" While her father opted for a colder, more calculated tone, filled with words like ungrateful and shame. Laura read everything, but didn't respond. She had learned that sometimes the only way to win an argument with people like that was to not participate. When the phone finally stopped ringing, she felt strange, almost empty, as if the silence had become too much. But it was a necessary emptiness, a space where she could finally breathe. The nights were harder. She slept little, and when she did, she dreamed of endless hallways where her father called her name without seeing her. She woke up drenched in sweat, feeling like something inside her was still asking permission to exist. At those times, She would sit by the window and gaze at the distant lights of downtown Portland, imagining all the lives that carried on without needing approval. She began to notice things she'd previously ignored. The smell of freshly baked bread from the cafe on the corner, the neighbor whistling 90s songs, the trees changing color in front of her building. Insignificant little things that suddenly became proof that life went on, and that she could too. One morning, while checking her email, she found an official notification from Thornberry Systems confirming her hiring. The letter read, "Welcome to the environmental engineering team. Your profile stands out for its commitment, independence, and leadership." Laura read those words several times, smiling without realizing it. That phrase, independence and leadership, felt like a kind of symbolic reparation. She printed the document and posted it on the wall, right below the diploma that no one had congratulated. It was her way of reminding herself that everything she had achieved had been her own merit, without applause, without sponsors, without family to support her. And in that moment, she understood that her story no longer depended on anyone's approval, but on the silent work she had done to build herself. Yet freedom came at a price. Loneliness weighed on her. The weekends stretched like empty hallways, and though the new job kept her busy, the nights were colder than before. Sometimes she hesitated. She wondered if she'd been too harsh, if perhaps she should have waited for another time to speak. But all it took was remembering her father's expression when he saw the check to dispel any guilt. That face, half surprise, half defeat, was proof that she'd done the right thing. And yet, deep down, something in her longed for someone to understand, for someone to say, "I understand. You did the right thing." Not for validation, but because after so many years of silence, she longed to be truly heard. 3. Days later, someone knocked on her door. Laura thought it was a neighbor or a delivery boy, but when she opened it, she found Jessica standing there. She was wearing an expensive coat, her makeup flawless, and carrying a bouquet of flowers that seemed more like an excuse than a gift. For a moment, the two stared at each other without saying anything. Laura couldn't remember the last time her sister had visited without a superficial reason. "Can we talk?" Jessica asked, her voice a mixture of firmness and nervousness. Laura hesitated for a few seconds before stepping aside to let her in. The small, modest apartment seemed like another planet compared to the luxurious world Jessica lived in. But what really separated them wasn't the square footage, but the years of emotional distance accumulated between them. Jessica began the speech Laura had been expecting. "You ruined my wedding. Everyone was talking about you. Mom won't stop crying." But what came next surprised her. "I just wanted to understand why you did that. I don't understand." Laura took a deep breath, sat across from her, and decided to speak without a filter. She told her about the sleepless nights, the 3 jobs, the scholarships, the times she ate rice with butter to avoid spending more. She told her about her empty graduation, the unanswered messages, the constant indifference. Jessica listened in silence, and little by little her makeup began to fade with tears. "I never knew anything about that," she murmured, her voice breaking. And for the first time, Laura didn't feel anger. She felt relief. Finally, someone was watching her. The conversation lasted for hours. Laura spoke unhurriedly, as if the words had been waiting years to come out. Jessica, who had initially arrived ready to defend her parents, ended with trembling hands, staring at the floor. "I always thought you were cold, that you didn't want to be with us," she said between sobs. "And I always thought you didn't need me," Laura replied, with a sincerity that made them both fall silent. There had been so much accumulated misunderstanding that they didn't even know where to begin to repair it. But amidst that confusion, Laura noticed something new. For the first time, Jessica wasn't speaking from a place of arrogance, but from guilt. It was a small gesture, a crack in the wall of a lifetime, but enough for Laura to feel that maybe, just maybe, there was a possibility of forgiveness. Before leaving, Jessica approached the doer and, her voice shaking, said, "I want you to know that what you did was brave. No one at home would dare confront him like that." Laura nodded without responding. When the door closed, she stared at the empty space her sister had left, as if she could see the words floating in the air. Brave. That word resonated within her with a new, different weight. Not because she needed recognition, but because it finally came from someone who had been on the other side. That night, as she made herself some tea, she considered that perhaps the first step to healing wasn't forgiving others, but learning to believe in her own worth. A week later, when Laura was beginning to feel that her family's silence was final, she received an unexpected call. It was Trevor, Jessica's new husband. His voice sounded tense, almost nervous. He asked to meet her at a downtown coffee shop, saying he needed to talk to her about something important. Laura hesitated but accepted. The meeting was brief and awkward. Trevor arrived with a furrowed brow and tired eyes, ordered a coffee that he didn't touch, and after a few minutes of silence, spilled the beans. Her father had asked her for a loan of $20,000 weeks before the wedding, promising to repay it as soon as he closed a deal. The loan expired, the money never came back, and now the man was asking for $15,000 more, citing a temporary crisis. Trevor seemed more confused than angry, and Laura realized that he still didn't know who he was dealing with. She didn't hesitate. She looked him straight in the eyes and told him what no one else would dare. "My parents have been broke for years. They've only learned to pretend." Trevor watched her incredulously at first, but the confidence with which she spoke left no room for doubt. Laura told him how her father used appearances as a shield, how the facade of a perfect family was just a cover for excesses and debt. For the first time, someone outside of that dynamic listened to the story without trying to minimize it. Trevor remained silent, stirring the cold coffee with his spoon. "It was all a lie then," he murmured, as if talking to himself. "Not everything," Laura replied calmly. "Just what was convenient for them to show." And as she said it, she felt some of the weight she'd carried since she was a child begin to dissolve. That same night, Jessica called her. Her voice was tense, but no longer reproachful. "Trevor told me everything," she said, bluntly. "I need to know if it's true." Laura didn't want to prolong the phone conversation. She invited her to her apartment the next day. When Jessica arrived, she had a folder full of documents, bank statements, receipts, and bills in her parents' names. They spent hours going through them one by one, until the truth became impossible to deny. The debts were enormous, the loans were overdue, and the dates showed that the family's stability was a sham sustained only by words. Jessica, who had always believed she lived in a solid home, burst into tears. "All my life I was told you were the irresponsible one," she whispered, "and you were the one silently holding it all together." From that day on, the sisters bonded in a new way, not out of love, not even nostalgia, but out of a shared need to understand how they had gotten there. Jessica and Trevor confronted their parents directly, demanding explanations, and what they found was a wall of excuses, reproaches, and denials. The father claimed that it was all about family. The mother cried, blaming bad luck, and both avoided acknowledging the obvious. They had lived off appearances and other people's money. Laura didn't participate in that discussion. She didn't need to. She knew the truth was out in the open and that, for the first time, she wasn't the one who had to prove her worth. From a distance, she watched the glass castle her parents had built crumble, and she felt an almost poetic calm as she watched them confront the same emptiness she'd known since she was a child. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Jessica and Trevor hired a financial advisor to try to salvage what little remained of the family business. But what they discovered was even worse. Their father had mortgaged the house without telling anyone, and was using their mother's savings account to cover the interest. Trevor's loan money was gone in less than 2 months, and much of the bank statements were in his father's name, who insisted it was all temporary. When Jessica showed him the documents, he reacted furiously, accusing her of betrayal for reviewing his finances. But this time she didn't back down. "You lied to all of us," she screamed, and for the first time in her life, her voice sounded louder than his. Laura listened to everything later on the phone, and while she felt compassion, she also understood that every family has its own breaking point, and that hers had arrived. Shortly after, an unexpected event tested Laura's strength again. Her mother called her one morning crying inconsolably. Her father had suffered a heart attack. "You have to come," she pleaded. "He needs us." Laura remained silent, holding the phone while the coffee grew cold on the table. She didn't know how to respond. Part of her still retained the habit of running whenever someone in her family needed her, but another part, the one that had learned to breathe without guilt, reminded her that it wasn't her duty to save anyone. She asked if he was out of danger, and when she heard that he was, she hung up with a firm voice. That night, as she walked across the Hawthorne Bridge watching the lights reflect in the river, she understood something. Some emergencies don't call for medical help, but for emotional control, and this time she wouldn't fall into that trap. Over the next few days, her mother's calls became insistent, almost desperate. "Your father is very ill," she repeated over and over. "He says he needs you, that you forgive him." Laura listened silently, promising nothing. Deep down, she knew that what her mother was really asking for wasn't support, but rather a return to the way things were, with her playing the role of the daughter who remains silent, gives in, and holds fast. But something inside Laura couldn't return to that place. Each manipulative word sounded like an old echo, a script she knew by heart. "I can't help you keep denying what they did," she finally replied, with a calm she didn't feign. Her mother cried, insulted her, then pleaded again. And when she hung up, Laura felt that was the true end of her emotional obedience. A week later, a letter arrived. She recognized it by her father's heavy, cramped handwriting. She opened it slowly, knowing what she would find: reproaches, moralistic phrases, and the inevitable guilt disguised as reflection. Indeed, it was all there. "I never wanted you to suffer, but you disappointed me," one paragraph read. "Your silence is killing me." Laura read to the end, took a deep breath, and without a second thought, lit a match and let the paper slowly burn in the sink. The flames briefly illuminated the dark kitchen, and in that fleeting glow, she understood that burning that letter was not an act of revenge, but of liberation. She didn't need any more explanations, nor conditional forgiveness. She just wanted to move forward without the constant shadow of the duty that was never hers. Time passed, and while the family sank into its own ruins, Laura quietly rose. At Thornberry Systems, her name began to circulate with respect. She was meticulous, intuitive, and possessed a clarity that impressed even the most experienced engineers. When she was offered the position of leading a municipal project on urban sustainability, her first reaction was disbelief. Then came pride, a pride she had learned to recognize without shame. On the day of the official presentation before the city council, she arrived. With her hair tied back, a sober suit, and a serenity that radiated authority. As she explained her proposal, projecting graphics on the big screen, she thought about how many times she'd been told she had no voice. Now everyone was listening. And the strangest thing was, she didn't need to raise it. The project was unanimously approved, and her name appeared in the local newspapers. The article highlighted her technical innovation and environmental vision. "The young engineer who will transform." "Portland," read the headline. Laura cut out the article and put it in a folder, not to boast, but as a testament to the fact that scars can also become a force. That same week, her mother sent her a short message. "We saw you on the news. Your father is proud." She didn't respond. She knew that such pride wasn't about love, but about appearance. And while a part of her was tempted to respond again, another more mature part understood that it wasn't about denying the past, but about not reliving. Yet as the months passed, The distance between her and her parents became clearer, but less painful. She no longer hated them. She simply understood them like someone looking at an old painting hanging on a wall. It's there, part of history, but it no longer generates emotions. Jessica, on the other hand, began to visit her frequently. The conversations between them went from initial discomfort to a complicity they'd never had before. They talked about work, memories, and also wounds. Jessica, more aware now, confessed that she sometimes dreamed of going back and asking forgiveness from the teenagers she'd ignored. "I can't change what we did," she said one afternoon, "but I can make sure I don't repeat it." Laura listened silently, with a slight smile. It was strange to see something as genuine as guilt transformed into learning in her sister. One day, Jessica invited her to lunch with Trevor. The meeting was simple, without the usual tension of family gatherings. Amid laughter and reminiscing, Trevor mentioned that his father was still not fully recovered, and that they were officially closing the family business. Laura took this as a matter of course. There were no more surprises left. But when Jessica, in a soft voice, asked if she would ever consider reconciling with them, Laura lowered her gaze and said something that surprised even her. "Maybe someday, but not because they deserve it, but because I no longer need to prove anything." Jessica nodded, and in that shared silence, they both understood that forgiveness doesn't always mean going back, but rather moving forward without letting the past hold you back. A few more months passed before something unexpected happened. One afternoon, Laura received an email with a simple subject line, "Can we get coffee?" It was from her father. She hesitated to open it, fearing it was another string of reproaches disguised as affection, but the content was different. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I need to talk to you without yelling, without excuses. I'm learning to listen." There were no grand apologies, no empty promises, just a sentence that seemed written by someone tired of fighting against themselves. Laura read the message 3 times before deciding to respond. She agreed to the meeting, but made it clear that she wasn't looking for a forced reconciliation. She wanted to understand if, after all, there was something real between them beyond hurt or distance. The cafe was a neutral, small place, with a cinnamon aroma and soft conversations in the background. When he arrived, he seemed more fragile, aged by more than just the years. His eyes were dull, but not hostile. "I'm not going to ask you to forget anything," he said bluntly. "I just want you to know that I was wrong." Laura listened without interrupting. He talked about how he had confused control with love, pride with care, and how the fear of failure led him to project onto Jessica everything he failed to see in her. For the first time, there was no drama, no tears, no manipulation. Just a man acknowledging his mistake in the face of the woman his daughter had become. And in that honest silence, Laura understood that forgiveness, when it comes without demands, stops hurting. After that conversation, something changed definitively. It wasn't a spectacular reconciliation or a perfect redemption story, but it was a necessary closure. Laura left the cafe with a strange feeling, as if she'd left a heavy suitcase on the table and could finally walk without dragging it. She didn't feel love or resentment, only relief. On the way home, she thought about how family wounds sometimes don't fully heal, but stop bleeding when you stop touching them. That afternoon, as she watched the sunset tint the buildings orange, she understood that she no longer lived in anyone's shadow. She wasn't the invisible daughter or the silent disappointment. She was simply her, with her scars, her career, her peace. As time passed, her story became something she told only when she felt she could help someone else. In work meetings or casual conversations, if someone brought up family, she would smile and say, "Sometimes love also means walking away." She didn't say it with sadness, but with the wisdom of someone who survived a life of broken expectations. Jessica and she remained close, sharing coffees and confidences they wouldn't have imagined before. Her parents, now living modestly in a small house in the countryside, continued to send postcards on special occasions, always signed with, "We love you." Laura read them tenderly and kept them in a box, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder that love, when it stops hurting, finally becomes true. Years later, Laura walked the streets of Portland on her way to college, where she was pursuing her master's degree in environmental policy. The air smelled of wet earth and eucalyptus, and the city, with its mix of gray and green, reminded her of everything she'd been through to get there. Sometimes young students recognized her from her lectures or her work on sustainability projects. They asked for advice, admired her professional history, unaware that behind that calm lay a past filled with silences and invisible battles. She smiled gratefully and thought about how ironic it was. For years she sought to be seen by her family, and in the end, it was the world that saw her for who she truly was. That night, when she got home, she opened the window and looked at the reflection of the lights on the river. She thought about the check she had handed over that wedding day, about everything it symbolized. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It had been the exact moment a woman had chosen her freedom. She no longer felt anger or sadness, only gratitude for having chosen herself. Before going to sleep, she wrote a sentence in her notebook, a kind of intimate epitaph. Sometimes, the only way to be seen is to step out of the picture. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and smiled. She knew she hadn't won against anyone, only for herself, and for the first time in her entire life, that victory was enough.